laughing over this, because they knew that if this goes in their favor, they can overthrow the Muslims and take back Medina. So now they come up to the Prophet ﷺ to say, قَالُوا إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ. Look, all these people, they're all gathering up on your front doorsteps. You can't beat them. There's too many people. How do you expect to beat them? Just give up. Stop fighting. Just let them defeat you. Don't even bother fighting back. Yet the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, what do they say in return? Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. We are content with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qadr, and we entrust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us in this moment of desperate need. They had full conviction in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Instead of their iman dropping, it increased. And what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do? He granted them this victory. He allowed them to escape from this very, very tight situation where they were completely surrounded from all sides. The Quraysh and their allies attacking from the front, while the Munafiqun trying to launch their plot from behind. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala managed to allow the Muslims, He managed to let the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahabi, let them all destroy, to defeat the Quraysh army and foil the plot of the Munafiqun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted them that victory. Now, when we look at these two stories, the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam and the story of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we can see a bit of a common thread happening here. And it is that when they were at their most desperate need, they asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for assistance. Yet, they also asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His assistance, even when they had all the odds for them. When they had all the help that they could ever need, they still had the same level of tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as they did when they were at their lowest moments. Look at Ibrahim alayhi salam. Look at the incident of the fire. Fast forward several years later, there he is building the Kaaba with his son Ismail alayhi salam, surrounded with his family. He has all the support that he would need to fulfill this amr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to build this Kaaba. Yet he still relies on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, still making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he needs His help to protect his progeny from being led astray. He's still asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept this ibadah that he's doing, building the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is still asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His help, in the same way that he was asking for His help when he was being thrown into the fire. And look at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the battle of Khandaq, when he was being surrounded by the Quraysh and the Munafiqun. Even in the situation in Ta'if, when he reached out to the people of Ta'if to turn them to Islam, yet they all humiliated him, ridiculed him, pelted him with stones. Not a single voice among the people of Ta'if standing up to defend him. He was at a complete low point at that moment. He had no support whatsoever. Yet fast forward several years later, when the Prophet ﷺ was at the doorsteps of Mecca with an enormous Muslim army ready to defeat the Quraysh in Mecca, to conquer Mecca. Even in such a moment where victory seems inevitable, the Prophet ﷺ still had that same level of trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as he did back when he was being persecuted in Ta'if. The same way that he had the trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when all the odds seemed to be stacked against him in the battle of Khandaq. In all of these instances, we see how they were able to develop such level of trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both in the most desperate time of need and even when there was all the help that they could ever have, they still had that level of trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the kind of lesson that we should derive from these stories, where whenever we have any sort of a problem that we have, any sort of issues that we may have, any physical dilemmas, any sort of spiritual crises that we are going through, any sort of problem that we face in life, we should always first turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if we may have some ways to help us, even if we have some support group that can help us, we still first turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He's the only one that could provide us help. When we make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are developing that deeper connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that we can be able to gain His assistance. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that if He wanted to, we could go to sleep with full functionality of our legs. Yeah, when we wake up in the morning, we could lose it just like that. No explanation necessary. That's the power Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has over us. So isn't it a wise thing to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His assistance every step of the way? Have that level of trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if you may have all the chances to succeed? That's the kind of mindset that we should try to nurture into our hearts. Because then it allows us to develop a deeper love with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the question is, of course, how can we develop such love in our hearts? How can we make this a part of our lives? How can we make this mindset part of how we think all the time? أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي على رسول الكريم أما بعد. My dear brothers and sisters, we need to remember that dua is an essential part of our lives. When we look at the books of hadith, when we look at the books of a'mal and adhkar that we can look at, what we can read, we can always see all these beautiful examples and all of these beautiful remedies that the Prophet ﷺ gives us. And of course, the best one that we can always start with is Hasbiyallah wa ni'mal wakil. Yes, so simple yet so powerful. When we look at our brothers and sisters who are suffering in Gaza, do we see them losing any sort of hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Do we see them curse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the predicament that they are in? We see them increasing in their iman. We see them still having hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He will save them from this dilemma that they are facing, this massacre that they are suffering. They still maintain that level of trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when the whole world seems to be against Him, when they all are being persecuted by both the countries that are fighting against them, as well as the media that are coming up with these lies to try to support those who are trying to oppress the Palestinians. Do we see them losing any sort of hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? They still maintain that level of tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if they're able to maintain that level of trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if they're able to be content with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qadr, then what's stopping us from having that level of tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What's stopping us from embodying the message of Hasbiyallah wa ni'mal wakil? So I ask all of us today to try to leave here today with this thought in mind, that we need to develop a deeper bond with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Develop a deeper level of trust with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Start with du'as like Hasbiyallah wa ni'mal wakil. At least take that step forward, that desire to even get to that level. And the rest, of course, follows through as we keep moving forward. Keep looking at the different a'mal that we can embody. Keep pondering over the virtues and the benefits that these kinds of du'as that the Prophet ﷺ gave us. And when we do that, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will develop a deeper love with us. And we will in return also develop a deeper love and connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it may also be our means of salvation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will use that as a hujjah for us so that we can be able to enter into a paradise. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us in our most vulnerable times. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be with us when no one is around us, as well as when everyone else is still around us. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be with us and our brothers and sisters suffering in Gaza. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring us ease in our moments of difficulty. Inna Allah wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima. اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وصل على المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات والأحياء منهم والأموات إنك سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات. وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم: الله في أصحابي لا تتخذهم غرضا من بعدي، فمن أحبهم فبحبي أحبهم، ومن أبغضهم فببغضي أبغضهم، وخير أمتي قرني ثم الذين يلونهم ثم الذين يلونهم، والسلطان ذل الله، من أهان سلطان الله في الأرض أهانه الله. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم انصر المسلمين في غزة، اللهم ارفع عنهم الظلم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم اغفر شهداءنا في غزة يا أرحم الراحمين. آمين يا رب العالمين. وقال الله تعالى: فاذكروني أذكركم واشكروني ولا تكفرون. أقيموا الصلاة.